Over the last few days, the internet has been possessed, and rightly so, with guessing who are the characters that are going to die in the next episode of Game of Thrones, which is episode 3, the battle for Winterfell. Instead of guessing who's going to die, I'm going to try and analyze who should die. By that I mean narratively speaking. I think it would be a shame just to pile on bodies for tragic effect. I understand that some characters need to die, but from a narrative standpoint, I wouldn't want a character to die before their series arc is resolved. So the question I'll be asking is which of the characters finished their arc already or could finish it over the course of the next episode. Let's start with a character who is a favorite to die in many Deadpools. Jorah Mormont. Jorah's had 2 overall arcs throughout the series. The first being one of redemption. He started out being a shamed nobleman after having sold men into slavery and fleeing into exile, and in the beginning of our story, Jorah's trying to get back a modicum of honor through his devotion to Daenerys. But he fails in that because he manages to betray her and, again, be exiled. So he doesn't get any redemption yet, and instead even more shame than he started out with. That's when Jorah contracts grayscale, which we can look at as a physical manifestation of his shame and guilt. So then, even though he saves Dany's life and she is cool with him again, he can't stay with her because of his grayscale, which represents his shame. So he can't stay with her because of his shame. He might have redeemed himself in her eyes, but not in his own eyes. And when she sends him to go cure himself, we can understand this in more ways than one. His grayscale is both an embodiment of his shame and a significant part of his redemption through suffering. Physically, by having the disease, and then emotionally by having to choose to stay away from Dany, both equally torturous for him. The curing process and the agony that comes with it is the culmination of purifying through suffering. Interestingly, the only reason he was able to be cured is because Sam knew and admired Jorah's father, Jeor. His father was the original person who he failed and shamed, which is to say, the original sin had to be forgiven by proxy so that the next one could be too. So this arc is resolved, but Jorah can't die yet because he still has a secondary arc, which I'm going to call Independence. The reason Jorah sold men into slavery in the first place was because he was seriously in debt, and that was because of his wife, Lynesse. She was a woman half his age who was described as looking like Dany, and he was madly in love with her. Thing is, she came from a rich family, and Jorah was trying to give her the luxurious life she was used to, all the way to bankruptcy. So Jorah completely disregarded himself for the woman he loved and let himself be swallowed and consumed by the love and his need to please her. And that is just what has been happening to him with Dany. His love for her is all-consuming to the point that we as viewers can't see a reason for his character's existence outside of him being at Dany's side. If after all these years and everything he's been through, Jorah's raison d'être is still the woman he loves, we have an unresolved arc. So could we resolve this in the next episode? I think it's possible. All that Jorah has to do is just once separate himself from Dany. Our expectation is that he's going to die heroically trying to save her, but he can't both live and die for her. If we want to finish this arc with his death, he has to die defying Dany. Not betraying her, but separating himself from her and becoming an independent character. One way to do it could be dying saving Gilly and baby Sam. Since Dany killed Sam's family, dying while saving Sam's other family would be at least metaphorically defying her. And it will also connect to the resolution of his redemption arc through Sam, which is even more of a party. I'm sure there could be other and better ways to do it, but I think the way Jorah can die with his character completely resolved is if he manages to achieve separation and independence. Next, we have the Hound. I've been hearing mostly that he can't die yet because he has to kill his brother, the Mountain. While I think it's very likely to happen, I don't think that it needs to. The Hound's arc is about healing from trauma. And yes, his brother is the cause of that trauma, but in no way is killing your abuser a way to deal or heal. That's a different type of arc, revenge. And if anything, the Hound has become less and less vengeful throughout his development. His trauma is of course fire, so being able to use fire would be a compelling resolution. That's why people say that he's going to use fire to kill his brother. But that is ignoring an additional journey his character has been making, which is toward compassion. Getting over his need for vengeance or for violence and replacing them with his tendency for compassion, which he has been kind of trying to ignore and conceal while he was hiding behind what he described as loving to kill. So he has kind of been pulled in two separate directions, compassion versus vengeance and violence. We saw in his interactions, first with Sansa and then with Arya, that he has compassion and that some people trigger it in him. And we saw the conflict best during his time with Brother Ray. Then he was kind of leaning towards compassion and learning it anew, but then after his death, he was being pulled back into vengeance and violence. It has been alluded to that the way for the Hound to heal from his trauma would be to let go of the anger and violence that the trauma planted within him, which means that in order to resolve the Hound's arc, he doesn't just need to use fire. He needs to use it in a non-violent way, in a compassionate way. That's definitely not killing his brother with fire. But the battle for Winterfell might give the Hound an opportunity to do that. A scenario like that could be if somebody is going to die and maybe asks the Hound to not let them turn. That would be a way for him to use fire in a compassionate way. So the point is, the Hound doesn't need to live through the battle so he could kill his brother, because killing him would kind of ruin his development. If he's able to get over both his fear of fire and his need for violence, that would be a true healing from his trauma. A character who I think is in question is Brienne. What are you talking about? She was knighted last episode. Of course she should die. Well, on one hand, yes. Brienne's arc was partially about recognition. She is, and always has, embodied the true characteristics of a knight, and we saw it reflected in Jaime's words when anointing her. And now she's finally named what she truly is, and always has been. That is a compelling arc that is now resolved. But, unlike the other characters, with Brienne I think the resolution of an arc isn't necessarily enough. Because I think she's reached an internal resolution, but it didn't yet affect the world around her. Brienne is not just a character, she's also a symbol of the patriarchal world that wouldn't recognize her for who she is because of her sex. A symbol of the tradition of that world and of the glass ceiling and all that. But our story is about change, and specifically about the world changing. So I think it's not enough that a couple of her friends would name her a knight. The world has to accept it and accept her as such. So being made a knight isn't enough. Brienne has to actually serve as a knight in the world that now has changed enough to allow it. And that is something that takes a while. That's not resolved with one event. Next, I'm going to talk about Jon. It's pretty obvious that he's not going to die yet, being a pretty serious protagonist, and I agree that he shouldn't, because other than saving the world, etc., he still has a character journey to complete. Jon's arc is about worthiness. A recurring theme in this story is being thrown into a position of power and not wanting it. It started when he was made a steward, when he wanted to be a ranger, because Jorah was trying to groom him for command. After that, he was elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch without even putting his name in the running. The third time was when he was named King in the North. He accepted all of these reluctantly because it was the right thing to do for the people. The reluctance, in my opinion, comes from a feeling of unworthiness. Now that he's got a fourth position of power he never asked for, which is the rightful king of the Seven Kingdom, he has a chance to finally feel worthy of power, and more than that, to want that power. Now, it's important to distinguish between worthiness and competence. Jon certainly feels competent and adequate. In the beginning of his days in the Night's Watch, he even claimed to be better than everybody else. Later on, when he took command over the Watch and then over the entire North, he felt and acted like he knew what he was doing. He even admitted to Dany that he doesn't like what he's good at, referring to fighting and to leading. I think part of why he doesn't like it is because he feels unworthy of it. And that is because he has been made to feel this. Even back in Winterfell, he was good with a sword, so he didn't exactly feel incompetent. But next to Robb, he did feel unworthy. All his life being told that what he is, a bastard, is wrong and bad and shameful, he learned that it doesn't matter if he's just as competent as Robb. He doesn't deserve all that Robb is going to get, which mainly is a position of power. So, from the beginning, in order to protect himself from this dissonance, he had to convince himself that he doesn't want what Robb has. And so this frame of mind kept on even after he left Winterfell. Not believing he's worthy, which leads to convincing himself that he doesn't want it anyway. But now Jon learned that he's the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna. And yes, it means he's the heir, but more importantly to him, it means that he's a product of love rather than the product of a dishonorable and shameful mistake. Accepting this means that Jon no longer has to feel unworthy and gross and bad and all that, which in turn means that he can actually finally want it. So this discovery not only gives him power, it also frees him up to want this power for the first time. Now he can combine the feeling of adequacy with that of worthiness. So unlike his reluctance to lead until now, this fourth and final position being thrown at him is something that he should want and even demand. And that is how he can resolve his main character arc. Okay, this is getting a bit long, so we'll do this in an installment. We still have several characters to talk about, and hopefully I'll be able to complete this before the next episode airs. So thank you for listening.